So if, for instance, we use sheep grazing and we implement it or convert a land as been intensively fertilized, it's going to give way more positive benefits to the soil, to the biological diversity, to integrate seasonal.
How can we scale photovoltaics without sacrificing sustainability? A question that basically has been around since the construction of the very first large-scale PV power plants on greenfield sites. Now, in times when project and generation scales are reaching new dimensions, it's more important than ever to find an answer. So how can open space plants be implemented in harmony with nature and landscape regulations? How can biodiversity be preserved and promoted with the expansion of PV plants? And what criteria come into play in environmental assessments that contribute to site selection? In this episode, you'll get some answers. Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. My guest today is Lina Dubina, Policy Advisor for Sustainability at SolarPower Europe, the European Solar Association representing companies and organizations active along the whole solar value chain. Lina works on sustainability-related policy developments for PV products as part of the sustainability workstream. Apart from that, she also oversees the work on agrivoltaics and coordinates several environment-related projects. Welcome, Lina. Awesome to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me here today.
Well, Lina, since large-scale PV projects are around, there also have been conflicts with other types of land use, for example, agriculture. So to what extent can local spatial planning contribute to mitigate these conflicts?
So local spatial planning in general is a great tool and can provide lots of benefits when we're talking about deploying solar PV. And that also depends on whether that's a local, regional, or national spatial planning. It will still bring a lot of different benefits when we talk about siting of solar or renewable energy sources in general. For one, it can allow to identify different types of suitable land that could potentially be used up for the developers to site these solar PV plants. For instance, first sort of a layer of a benefit that it brings is to allow to identify these low risk areas that we in the solar industry, we have defined them as these acceleration areas. And these are areas that usually are already sealed lands or artificial lands or potentially have low environmental impacts. So this tool can then allow to identify these sites and then provide potentially also the data on what exactly provide environmental data on these sites. So the second layer that we have, or the second benefit of spatial planning, is also looking at larger areas. So as you rightfully said, we will need to deploy larger utility scale solar PV plants. So we're gonna have to deploy or find a larger solar sites. So for instance, looking at agricultural lands or any other type of land that would be needed for solar siting. So spatial planning then allows to synergize these zones and potentially map out in a harmonized way on what different types of land do we have, including different types of environmental characteristics. And then on top of that, it can also add the layer of different social economic elements to this map. So at the end of the day, we have a harmonized map out or a layout of different type of land use activities. And then on top of that, providing these specific zones that can be deployed for solar PV.
So what you mentioned so far seems more like a technical approach and being as efficient as possible and more like a planning approach. To what extent is also communication and participation of the actual affected locals important?
It's quite important. And I think this is also something just as part of the solar industry we bring forward and we see the added value is also including the citizens not only into the decision making but also in the planning phase. And when we do these spatial plannings, whether again it's local, regional, national level, they have this step where they include local communities into the consultation process. And then that brings not only the transparency layer, but also allows then to have this social acceptance of different solar PV projects, because we've integrated local communities into the decision and planning process.
Now, of course, PV projects are part of renewables and the whole transformation of our energy systems, and as such, of the big push to decarbonize basically everything we do. We're very much in the carbon tunnel. Biodiversity actually is much more imminent as a crisis. So ideally, you would, of course, tackle both problems at the same time. But to what extent is it really cost effective to actually implement biodiversity measures also in large-scale PV projects or plants?
So first of all, talking about the biodiversity PV, there are different types of biodiversity PV projects. Usually it's a ground-mounted solar PV project that incorporates different biodiversity aspects. It could be putting sheep grazing on grasslands or pastures. It could be implementing pollinator habitats. It could be different type of environmental or biodiversity aspects that we implement on ground. So it really depends on what actions, what measure do we need to implement to assess the cost of such plant.
Mm-hmm. May I just ask, I really have to be critical here because I just know my German perspective, but if I drive through the landscapes here, even if I see sheep are not biodiversity as such because they're still farming cattle and not wildlife, and mostly they grass on very green grass. It doesn't seem to be exactly the sort of habitat that really allows insects to thrive. So how common is it that we actually do have wildflowers for insects, etc., and not for farming purpose?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So this again comes into the play when we do the solar PV plant design. And this is where we integrate these different aspects. Do we want to seed local native species? Do we want to create different flowering islands? Do we want to create different types of habitats for the reptiles to develop, etc.? So this again is part of the planning and design of the project phase, and will really depend from site to site. So it's very much site specific, area specific. But if you're referring back to the sheep grazing, again, it depends on the specific sites. So if, for instance, we use sheep grazing and we implement it or convert a land as been intensively fertilized, it's going to give way more positive benefits to the soil, to the biological diversity, to integrate seasonal sheep grazing, for instance. Again, this would be done in cooperation with local experts, local environmental NGOs that can tell you how often do we need to put these sheep on the ground, what benefits would they bring, and then, of course, monitor and see what type of data do we get from these plants.
And how common is it? Because like I say, this is purely personal and not based on any scientific data. That's why I'm asking. Mostly I see very closely cropped green grass. Rarely do I see sheep. And very rarely do I see actual wildflower habitats. So do you have like percentages to what extent these biodiversity measures actually are implemented?
To be honest, I do not have specific percentage of the numbers, but what I've seen working at the SolarPower Europe and working with the solar industry is that this concept becomes more and more implemented, not only in terms of only 1 to 2 projects, but it's also being implemented into the business model of the company. So that's becoming a core value for them to working with these biodiversity plans, to looking at the strategies and how can they better incorporate and improve the quality of these projects. So unfortunately, I can't give you a precise number, but this is definitely becoming more and more common for the PV developers or for the project owners to work on such projects.
So glad to hear that, because it just seems to be such a wasted opportunity to mount your PV out there in the landscape and then just have very closely trimmed grass underneath it. So, but looking from a farmer perspective, what benefits are there for the local farmers to actually giving their land up for mixed-use PV plants instead of their traditional crop production and farming?
There are a multitude of benefits. So I think the first and foremost that I like to pinpoint is the land use and resource efficiency, because now we're talking about using the farmland that continues to do the crop production, that maintains the farming activity, and we synergize it or we build a specific PV plant on top of that farming activity. So we obviously get a better land efficiency and resource efficiency. Now, the second sort of beneficial layer that we can top it up with is including the sustainability aspects in these agrivoltaic plants. So we can look at social economic benefits, but we can also look at the environmental benefits. Maybe one of them could be, for instance, looking at water management. So we know that if there's, for instance, a lot of rain is coming in, it can be detrimental to the soil. So it can wash away the soil, and that can cause the soil erosion. Versus building up a solar PV plant, it can protect with the PV modules the amount of water that's reaching the layer of the soil, and then easing out the soil erosion. And there's also potentials to include, for instance, rainwater collection sites. So this is specifically interesting to look at arid areas where the land water scarcity, it's a rather high issue. So where they can actually collect and store this rainwater and then use it for the agriculture practices. And just to add maybe another point, which is the social economic aspect. So I think it's also rather straightforward that we can then supply the green energy for the farmers. And then in the cases where we have a farmland or the PV product that is owned by the developer, then we can supply that green energy to the local or rural communities. So there's quite a lot of benefits when it comes to agrivoltaic projects.
Now it just seems to be such a no-brainer, but sometimes sustainability is very complex. So just a very short, mean question. Now, if farmers convert their land for the production of, on the one hand, renewable energies, on the other hand, more biodiversity, does it mean that we actually then end up importing, for example, more soy food stock from the Amazonas and cutting down the rainforest there? So we basically backfire in regards to our sustainability efforts. Is that a risk?
No. So another point that I didn't mention, which is in terms of the benefits, is that we're also looking on how to actually increase the crop yield. So we'll be looking at installing a specific type of agrivoltaic installations that are specifically designed for a specific type of a crop. And that gives us a better result, a higher yield if you're talking about annual crop productions. And this is very important, I think, for the solar industry, as well as for the farmers, for the researchers to sort of dive into more in the research and innovation and look at exactly how different types of PV technologies can improve the crop yield.
Wonderful. So that really sounds very thought through. Now, when we zero in on Europe, of course, everything is basically highly regulated. So what does the regulatory environment look like for this type of PV production developing, and what are current challenges? So
agrivoltaics on the European level is not a novel or not a new niche. So this is something that has already been developed for more than a decade. So that obviously means there's a lot of different regulatory initiatives that have been happening in multiple member states. So for instance, we have Germany, France, Spain, or Portugal that have been quite active in supporting these agrivoltaic projects. And clearly that means that they already have put in force certain regulatory initiatives for agrivoltaic projects. So for instance, just to give you one of the examples is the newly amended German Renewable Act that now recognizes the dual use of land and would actually support these agrivoltaic floating PV projects. Similarly, in France, for instance, it's been happening for multiple years where they put these innovative tenders specifically addressed for agrivoltaic projects. So they award different type of agrivoltaic projects based on certain criteria. And this is happening in multiple of countries. So there are a lot of different types of initiatives that we can see. But where the challenge comes is we have not seen yet one European harmonized or even a nationally based policy framework that looks specifically on agrivoltaics and that would allow to even easier deploy these type of PV projects. Now, another thing that we're seeing as a huge challenge is also the subsidies. So when we're talking about these CAP subsidies, which is the Common Agricultural Policy, which is the subsidies that the farmers get from the EU budget to maintain their agriculture activities. Now, if a farmer would want to deploy an agrivoltaics, so get these dual land use benefits, they may actually not be able to get the financing from the EU because these agrivoltaic projects are not being recognized on the national CAP plans. So there's a multitude of challenges, but I guess these two would be one of the biggest ones to address.
All right. Since earlier we were talking already about some challenges where one sustainability effort is in competition to the other. Of course, we're also trying to push reforestation also here in Europe in order to create more carbon sinks. So what way would be there to combine that with PV plants? Do you have a short insight?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So it depends on if we're talking about replanting native forests, native trees, or if we are specifically talking about agroforestry. So when you're talking about the native tree replanting, I think that would be not as feasible for agrivoltaic plants or for PV plants in particular because of the shading. So once the tree grows higher, it would give the shade or provide the shade to the PV modules, which would then make it less efficient in terms of energy production. However, what we can do is we can look at the project site and look at what is the buffer zones, what is the different areas nearby the fencing areas, what is the surrounding areas. We can actually do the replanting and seeding specific native plant seeds. So that is something potential that we could implement.
If you create these kind of projects, they also, of course, create a great story. And if there's something that companies at the moment are looking for, it's a great sustainability story. Sometimes they go a little bit too far and it seems to be more a greenwashing effort. So to what extent are these kind of biodiversity measures in the risk of just being a way for a company to show an effort for nature conservation while they're actually shying away from a meaningful contribution?
I would not say this is a high risk, just pretty much based on multiple reasons. Once when I reach out and I discuss these things with the developers, with the solar industry, with wider stakeholder groups, we can see that these are, again, as I mentioned before, this is something they implement in their business cases. So this is already part of their core value, as the industry has recognized this added value of having the quality to the project. So not just building solar PV projects where they can and how much they can, but looking actually on how to synergize this nature protection, environmental integration into PV projects, because it's beneficial for multiple of reasons, one of them being having the social acceptance from the public. Now, that being said, we also see that a lot of wider stakeholder groups, for instance, environmental NGOs, are working closely with these PV developers, with different agencies, with different associations like us, SolarPower Europe, and are creating the knowledge sharing and finding out best possible way on how to create these best practices and actually roll out them on the ground. And this is something also we've done from the SolarPower Europe side. So we work together with an environmental NGO to develop guidelines that is specifically looking not only on how to define the criteria for a good, sustainable, environmentally inclusive solar PV project, but also looking at outlining these existing projects that already has a good criteria, that already has this added quality to the project.
All right, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned earlier already that, for example, having cattle there can be a great way to restore land that has been over-fertilized. So to what extent can sustainable solar plants contribute to the restoration of degraded land as such? And I guess it also means that it does add some extra cost, these restoration measures. So how can they be financed?
So to answer the first question, I would say this is a rather novel area. So there's not that many projects that we see specifically in terms of restoration of degraded land or restoration of certain types of areas like dried out peatlands. There are a few, but it's not as common yet. So I think they're in the pipeline to be rolled out in the coming years. When we're talking about the financial aspect, I think at the moment, it's mostly the PV developers or the project owners that would be financing such measures. And again, if we are going back to the previous discussion, when we're looking at these PV projects, if we compare the cost, it's not as costly if we would compare it to agrivoltaic projects, for instance. So it's rather feasible for the developers, for the PV project owners to finance such projects in terms of restoration objectives. But we also see rather different and new business models coming in. For instance, we have our French members that are working with the restoration objectives for the PV projects. And what they've done, they've signed a pledge with their shareholders where they plan on investing a certain amount of money specifically for these restoration objectives in terms of improving the soil health, in terms of improving biodiversity, in terms of improving the carbon storage, etc. And I think this has also become more interesting for the investors. So looking at how can they finance good, sustainably inclusive PV projects. So I think we're going to see different types of business models evolving in the coming years.
Just to also have a clear picture in our heads, what kind of degraded land could we talk about apart from over-fertilized land?
Yeah, so as you said, one of the degraded lands would be type of agricultural land that's been intensively managed, whether that's by certain type of management practices or that's by using specific types of herbicides and pesticides. That could also be, for instance, different types of contaminated land, but this is again a tricky type of a land that we're talking about. We could also be looking at dried peatlands, restoring specific types of wetlands, which is obviously quite important and has also been already put forward by the governments, for instance, like Germany, to subsidize such projects where they can restore these dried out peatlands. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Lina, for this a quick deep dive into combining or into overcoming conflicting interests when it comes to large-scale PV plants and at the same time land use interests or biodiversity interests. Thank you so much. It's been great to hear that a lot can be done and a lot is being done, and that that was quite interesting, that it's being driven by the companies themselves rather than the EU subsidizing it heavily, I guess, which speaks for it. I mean, the more it is cost effective, the more likely it is that it actually gets implemented. And it sounded like that is the case. So that makes me very hopeful. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Today's episode is presented by SSE Solar and Battery, part of FTSE 100 company SSE. SSE Solar and Battery is helping the UK and Ireland to reach net zero by developing utility-scale assets. With a secured 700 megawatt solar and battery pipeline and a further 1 gigawatt of sites under assessment, SSE Solar and Battery aspire to generate and store sustainable energy for all.